12 armed men blocked the only exit. Rain washed the blood from Lucas's tailored suit. He was a dead man. Then, a heavy-set woman stepped out of the shadows, flicked a cheap bodega lighter, and turned a can of aerosol into a roaring inferno. His world burned, then changed forever. The rain in Chicago did not wash away the sins of the city. It merely allowed them to pool in the gutters. Beatrice Monroe knew this better than anyone. At 32, Bea was a woman who took up space in a world that constantly demanded she shrink. She was fat, gloriously, unapologetically heavy, carrying well over 250 pounds on her 5'5" frame. Her thighs chafed on the humid summer days, her soft, generous curves pushed against the seams of her polyester uniforms, and she walked with a heavy, deliberate thud that announced her presence long before she entered a room. Tonight, her feet were screaming in protest inside her worn-out sneakers after a brutal 14-hour double shift, managing the front desk and the laundry room at the Hotel Belvedere, a decaying establishment on the edge of the West End. It was 2:15 a.m. The alley behind the hotel smelled sharply of rotting vegetables, damp cardboard, and the metallic tang of ozone from the incoming thunderstorm. Bea hauled the massive black industrial trash bags toward the rusted dumpster, her breath coming in visible exhausted puffs. She paused, wiping a mixture of sweat and rain from her forehead, her thick curls plastered to her cheeks. She just wanted to go home, feed her orange tabby cat, and soak her aching joints in a hot bath. But the city had other plans. The sound of shattering glass and a wet, sickening thud echoed from the far end of the alley. Bea froze her hand, still gripping the slick plastic of the trash bag. She pressed her substantial back against the cold brick wall, merging into the deep shadows. A man was thrown violently into the light of the single, flickering halogen street lamp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than Bea's annual rent. But right now the suit was ruined, slashed at the shoulder, and soaking wet. Blood thick, dark, and terrifyingly real poured from a wound in his side, staining the white silk shirt underneath. This was Lucas Russo. Though Bea didn't know his name yet, the entire underground of the eastern seaboard knew him as the ruthless, calculating head of the Russo syndicate. Lucas spat a mouthful of blood onto the cracked pavement and forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the brickwork. His dark eyes, cold and dead as a shark's, scanned the darkness. He was a predator, but tonight he was the prey. From the mouth of the alley, shadows detached themselves from the gloom. 125. Eventually, 12 men stepped into the narrow corridor of brick and fire escapes. They were armed with heavy iron pipes, switchblades, and a few suppressed handguns glinting under the street lamp. Leading the pack was a man built like a meat locker, known on the streets as Brendan Gallagher. Brendan dragged a baseball bat along the brick wall, the scraping sound setting Bea's teeth on edge. "End of the line, Lucas." Brendan sneered, his voice a gravelly rumble over the pouring rain. "Victor sends his regards. Said to make sure you felt it before you went out." Lucas let out a low, humorless laugh, clutching his bleeding side. "Victor is a coward who sends dogs to do a lion's work. If you're going to kill me, Brendan, stop talking and do it. But I promise at least 4 of you are dying with me." Bea watched from the darkness, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Every instinct of survival, every self-preservation tactic she had learned, living in this brutal neighborhood, screamed at her to turn around, slip back through the hotel's service door and call 911. She was a civilian. She was a tired, overweight hotel clerk. She had absolutely no business interfering in a mafia execution. Yet as the 12 men raised their weapons and closed in on the bleeding man, an inexplicable surge of defiance rose within her large chest. She hated bullies. She hated the way arrogant men moved in packs, taking what they wanted, destroying what they couldn't. Bea looked down at the cleaning cart beside her. Resting on the top shelf was a massive industrial-sized can of Ozone Blast, aerosol air freshener, highly flammable, toxic, and pressurized to the extreme. In the pocket of her oversized cardigan rested the heavy brass Zippo lighter she had inherited from her late father. She didn't think. If she thought about it, she would have paralyzed herself with fear. With surprising agility for a woman of her size, Bea grabbed the aerosol can in her left hand and the Zippo in her right. She stepped out from behind the dumpster, the metal wheels of her cart squeaking loudly in the tense silence. The 12 men snapped their heads toward her. Lucas blinked through the rain, and blood, his vision swimming, staring at the sudden apparition of a very large, soaking wet woman in a bright pink cardigan. "Hey!" Brendan barked, aiming a heavy revolver at her. "Get lost, Shamu, before we put a bullet in your fat head." The insult, so deeply unoriginal, ignited a spark of pure, unadulterated rage in Bea's belly. She didn't shrink. She didn't cower. She planted her wide stance, flicked the top of the Zippo, and spun the flint. A bright orange flame roared to life, fighting the rain. "I am the night auditor of the Hotel Belvedere." Bear yelled, her voice shockingly loud, echoing off the narrow brick walls. "And you are loitering!" Before any of the men could process the sheer absurdity of her statement, Bea thrust the aerosol can forward and pressed down hard on the nozzle. The pressurized chemicals shot out in a thick white mist, immediately catching the flame of the Zippo. Whoosh! A massive roaring jet of blue and orange fire erupted from her hands, illuminating the alley like daylight. The makeshift flamethrower shot forward a terrifying 15 feet, a localized inferno of burning chemicals. The front line of thugs shrieked as the intense heat singed their eyebrows, melted their synthetic jackets, and forced them violently backward. Brendan dropped his gun, screaming as the flames licked his wrists. Panic raw and primal erupted among the hitmen as they trampled over each other to escape the confined tunnel of fire. "Run!" Bea screamed, turning her fierce gaze to the stunned Mafia Boss. Lucas Russo had faced down cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and heavily armed SWAT teams, but he had never seen anything quite like this. Adrenaline, sparked by sheer disbelief, flooded his system, overriding the agony of his wounds. He pushed off the wall. Bea didn't wait for him to catch up. She grabbed his uninjured arm with a surprisingly strong grip, her plush fingers digging into his ruined silk shirt. "Move, damn it!" she bellowed over the sound of the burning aerosol and the screaming men. She shoved him toward the narrow gap between the dumpster and the rear fence, abandoning her cart and the dying flames. Lucas stumbled, his heavy frame colliding with hers, but Bea braced herself. Her mass, usually a source of societal scrutiny, was her anchor right now. She held him up, supporting his weight against her soft, sturdy shoulder, and dragged him into the labyrinth of darkness away from the alley. The escape was an agonizing blur of rain shadows and burning lungs. For Bea, running was not a natural state. Every step sent shockwaves of pain up her shins, and her heart battered against her ribcage like a trapped bird. Her thighs rubbed together furiously under her wet skirt, the friction searing her skin, but the fear of the 12 men behind them was a far greater motivator than physical discomfort. She panted heavily, her breath wheezing, but she didn't stop. She wrapped her thick arm tightly around Lucas's waist, essentially hauling the 6'2" mobster through the slick, narrow walkways of the West End. Lucas was operating on pure survival instinct. The world was spinning his vision, tunneling at the edges. The knife wound in his leg sent jagged spikes of agony up his spine with every step, and the bullet graze on his ribs bled sluggishly, soaking Bea's pink cardigan. He could hear her ragged breathing, could feel the soft, deep warmth of her body pressed against him. Under different circumstances, the notorious Lucas Russo, leaning on a heavy-set civilian woman for survival, would be laughable. Right now, she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Left! B gasped, practically throwing him around a sharp corner onto 42nd Street. Almost there. They stumbled down half a flight of concrete stairs leading to the basement level of a dilapidated brownstone. B fumbled blindly in her pocket, with trembling, rain-slicked fingers finally producing a ring of keys. She jammed one into the rusted lock, twisted it violently, and shoved the heavy wooden door open. They collapsed into the dark apartment, Lucas hitting the worn linoleum floor with a heavy groan, bringing B down with him in a tangle of wet limbs. She rolled off him, gasping desperately for air, lying flat on her back as her chest heaved. The room smelled of vanilla candles, damp wool, and an underlying note of copper from Lucas's blood. For a long minute, the only sound in the small, cramped apartment was the frantic breathing of two people who had just cheated death. "Are they following?" Lucas managed to rasp, trying to push himself up on one elbow, but his arm gave out. "No." B wheezed, forcing herself to sit up. She wiped the wet hair from her face, her cheeks flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson from the exertion. "I took the cut-throughs. The gate locks automatically. They'd need a blowtorch to get through the alley fence." She slowly dragged herself up her knees, popping loudly in the quiet room. She flicked a switch and a dim yellow lamp bathed the room in light. Lucas squinted against the sudden brightness. He finally took a good look at his savior. She was a large woman. There was no dancing around the fact. Her wet clothes clung to the deep rolls of her stomach and the wide flare of her hips. Her face was round, framed by wild, frizzy brown hair, and dotted with a smattering of freckles across her nose. But what struck Lucas wasn't her size. It was the absolute, unyielding intensity in her wide, amber eyes. There was no pity, no trembling fear, only a fierce maternal pragmatism. "Don't bleed on the rug," B ordered gruffly, though her voice shook slightly. "It took me a month to get the deposit together for this place." Lucas let out a startling, genuine bark of laughter, which immediately turned into a violent coughing fit that sent fresh blood spilling over his hands. "Idiot," B muttered. She moved with surprising efficiency. She didn't flutter or panic. She stripped off her ruined cardigan, revealing a plain white t-shirt stretched tight over her generous bust. She walked into the tiny adjoining bathroom and returned a moment later, carrying a plastic bucket, a bottle of cheap vodka, a stack of clean white towels, and a heavy-duty first aid kit. "Take off the jacket," she instructed, kneeling beside him with a heavy thud. Lucas hesitated, the ingrained paranoia of his life screaming at him not to disarm or undress in front of a stranger. But he looked at her stern face and slowly peeled the ruined Brioni jacket off his shoulders, hissing as the fabric detached from dried blood. B didn't flinch at the sight of his muscled torso or the network of pale, jagged scars that mapped his chest the history of a violently lived life. She uncapped the vodka. "This is going to hurt like a son of a bitch. Bite down on this." She tossed him a rolled-up hand towel. "I don't need a—" Before he could finish, B poured a generous splash of the harsh alcohol directly onto the deep slash across his ribs. Lucas's body violently arched off the floor, a strangled roar tearing from his throat. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white as agony ripped through his nervous system. "Told you," B said simply, her face pale but her hands steady. She grabbed a towel and began applying intense, unyielding pressure to the wound. Who the hell are you?" Lucas gritted out, panting, staring up at the woman leaning over him. The soft weight of her arm pressed against his chest as she worked, grounding him in the agonizing present. "Beatrice." "B," she replied, her eyes focused entirely on the laceration. "And you are currently a massive inconvenience, mister." "Lucas," he said, deciding to omit his infamous surname. "Why did you help me, Beatrice? 12 armed men. You could have run." B paused, the pressure of her hands easing for a fraction of a second. She looked down at him, her amber eyes locking onto his dark ones. She saw a dangerous man, a man who dealt in violence. But in the alley she had only seen a human being about to be slaughtered. "Because they called me Shamu," B deadpanned, securing a thick pad of gauze over his ribs and taping it tightly. "And because nobody deserves to be cornered in the dark. Now shut up and let me look at your leg. If the femoral artery is nicked, you're going to bleed out on my linoleum, and I'll be very annoyed." Lucas watched her as she worked, fascinated. In his world, women were either elegant, slender ornaments draped over the arms of made men, or they were terrified collateral damage. Beatrice was neither. She was vast, solid, and undeniably real. She took up space, not just physically, but energetically. When she leaned over him, her soft stomach brushed against his arm, and instead of pulling away or apologizing for her body, she simply shifted her weight to get better leverage, entirely unbothered by her own magnitude. It was a kind of quiet, arrogant confidence that Lucas found utterly mesmerizing. After 30 grueling minutes, B had stitched the superficial knife wound on his thigh with surprisingly neat sutures and bound his ribs. She sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on a towel. "You need a hospital," she stated flatly. "I'm a hotel auditor, not a trauma surgeon. Those stitches will hold for maybe a day before they get infected." "No hospitals," Lucas said firmly, his voice low and dangerous. "If I go to a hospital, they finish the job. Those men, they weren't random thugs. They were professionals." B sighed, pushing her hands against her thick thighs as she leveraged herself to her feet with a groan. "Fine. You can have the sofa. Don't bleed on it. I'm going to make tea." "Do you want tea?" "Bourbon if you have it. You just lost 2 pints of blood, and I poured cheap vodka into your open flesh. You're getting Earl Grey, Lucas." As she waddled toward the tiny kitchenette, Lucas Russo, a man who commanded legions of heavily armed soldiers and dictated the criminal economy of the eastern seaboard, found himself doing exactly what the fat woman in the wet t-shirt commanded. The morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds of B's basement apartment, casting dusty stripes across the worn velvet sofa. Lucas awoke with a start, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His hand instinctively shot to his waistband for a gun that wasn't there. As his eyes adjusted, the events of the previous night came rushing back, the ambush, the betrayal, the fire, the large woman. He smelled bacon. Pushing himself up with a sharp hiss of pain, Lucas looked toward the tiny kitchen. B was standing at the stove, wearing an enormous pair of faded grey sweatpants and a t-shirt that read, "Support your local library." She was humming softly, expertly, flipping thick cuts of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. She turned, holding a spatula like a conductor's baton. "You're awake. Good. You didn't die in your sleep. That saves me a lot of paperwork." "You're very calm for a woman harboring a fugitive," Lucas rasped, swinging his long legs off the sofa. He realized someone had draped a heavy crocheted blanket over him during the night. "I'm too tired to be hysterical," Bay replied, sliding the bacon onto a paper towel-lined plate. She cracked 4 eggs into the grease. "Besides, I looked you up on my phone while you were unconscious. Lucas Russo, the butcher of the West End, alleged head of the Russo crime syndicate." Lucas froze, his dark eyes narrowing. The warm domesticity of the moment shattered, replaced by the chilling reality of his life. He calculated his options. He was injured, unarmed, and in a stranger's house. If you know who I am, why haven't you called the police? Bea scooped the eggs onto 2 plates and carried them to the small wooden table. She sat down heavily, the chair creaking under her weight. Because the police in this district are paid off by the mob. I've lived in the West End my whole life, Mr. Russo. I know how the ecosystem works. If I call the cops, Brendan Gallagher's crew will know where I am before the dispatcher hangs up. She pointed a fork at the empty chair opposite her. Sit down and eat. You need the protein to rebuild your red blood cells. Lucas moved slowly, easing himself into the chair. He looked at the mountain of food. You're not afraid of me. I'm terrified of you, Bea answered honestly, chewing a piece of bacon. But you're injured, and I have the advantage of being the one who didn't let you die. Eat. They ate in relative silence. Lucas couldn't stop looking at her. She ate heartily, enjoying the food without any of the performative guilt he was used to seeing from women. There was a grounded power in her self-acceptance. Suddenly, a sharp, buzzing vibration broke the quiet. Lucas's burner phone, still in his ruined suit pocket, draped over a chair, was ringing. He snatched it, checking the encrypted caller ID. It was Arthur "Artie" Pendleton, his oldest and most trusted consigliere. Lucas answered, pressing the phone to his ear. Artie, tell me you have good news. Boss, thank God. Artie's raspy voice crackled over the line. Rumor on the street was that Brendan's boys gutted you in the alleys. Where are you? Safe. For now. What's the situation? Artie hesitated, a terrible silence stretching over the line. It's bad, Dom. Real bad. Victor. Victor made his move. He aligned with the Moretti cartel overnight. He took over the South Side docks and the warehouse district. He told the captains that you were dead caught, lacking in the alleys. Lucas's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing groaned. His suspicions were confirmed. Victor Rossi, his underboss, the man he had treated like a brother, was the traitor. Only Victor knew my route from the hotel last night, Lucas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He set me up. He did, Artie confirmed. And Dom, they're looking for you. Brendan's crew is tossing the West End. But worse, they're looking for the woman. Lucas's blood ran cold. He looked up at Bea, who was watching him with wide, intelligent eyes. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? Lucas demanded. Brendan came back to Victor with 3rd-degree burns on his arms, Artie explained. Said some massive broad with a flamethrower ambushed them. Victor is furious. He ordered a hit on her. They're canvassing every apartment, every hotel, every diner within a 2-mile radius of that alley. They're looking for a fat woman with frizzy hair. They have orders to burn her alive. Lucas ended the call. The silence in the kitchen was suddenly suffocating. What's wrong? Bea asked, setting her fork down. The sudden pallor of Lucas's face told her everything she needed to know. Victor Rossi. Lucas began, his voice tight. The man who organized the hit on me. He knows about you. Bea swallowed hard, the heavy reality crashing down on her shoulders. They know who I am. They know what you look like, and they know you're in the neighborhood. Lucas stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in his leg. You saved my life, Beatrice, but by doing so you painted a target on your own back. Victor's men will not stop until they find you, and when they do, they won't just kill you. They will make an example of you. Bea stood up, her large hands gripping the edge of the table. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her stoic exterior. She looked around her tiny apartment, her mismatched mugs, the second-hand rug, the little cat bed in the corner where Barnaby was currently curled up asleep. This was her sanctuary, built over years of grueling labor and penny pinching. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, I have a life. I have a job. I have a cat. I can't just—" "You don't have a choice," Lucas snapped, closing the distance between them. He grabbed her shoulders, his large hands firm but not cruel. He forced her to look into his eyes. "Listen to me. Victor Rossi is a monster. If Brendan Gallagher finds you, he will torture you just for the humiliation you caused him. You are leaving with me. Right now." "To where?" Bea cried out, her voice trembling. "I'm a 260-pound woman. I don't exactly blend into the shadows, Lucas. Where the hell are we going to go?" "To my safe house in the Berkshires." Lucas stated his tone, brooking no argument. "It's heavily guarded. It's off the grid. You will be under my personal protection. I owe you my life, Beatrice Monroe, and a Russo never ever leaves a debt unpaid." Before Bea could argue further, the sound of screeching tires echoed from the street above. Heavy-booted footsteps pounded on the concrete stairs leading down to her basement door. "Open up! We know you're in there, Shamu!" A muffled, aggressive voice shouted from the other side of the heavy wooden door, followed by a violent, booming knock that shook the frame. Lucas's eyes locked onto the door, instantly calculating the threat. He turned back to Bea, his demeanor shifting from a battered man to the apex predator he truly was. "Grab the cat," Lucas ordered, his voice dangerously calm. "We're going out the back." The doorframe cracked with a deafening splinter of wood. Bea didn't freeze, and she certainly didn't scream. She grabbed a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the laundry pile, unceremoniously scooped up a fiercely complaining Barnaby, and zipped the orange tabby in, leaving a small gap for his head. "Window!" she hissed, pointing to the high, narrow egress window above the rusted washing machine. Lucas hoisted himself up, suppressing a harsh groan as his makeshift stitches pulled painfully taut and kicked the rusted latch open. He hauled his large frame through the opening and into the muddy service well outside. He reached back down into the darkness. "Give me your hands." Bea scrambled onto the washing machine. The metal dented ominously under her weight, but she didn't care. She shoved the heavy duffel bag up first, which Lucas grabbed, and then she reached up. His large, blood-stained hands locked around her thick forearms. With a surge of adrenaline and raw, desperate strength, he pulled. Bea pushed off the machine, squeezing her wide hips through the narrow concrete frame. The rough edges scraped her sides, but she tumbled out into the freezing mud beside him, just as the basement door gave way with a final, violent crash. "They went out the back!" Brendan's gravelly voice roared from inside the apartment. "Move!" Lucas grunted. He didn't let go of her arm. They scrambled out of the window well and sprinted into the labyrinth of the West End's back alleys. The rain was a torrential downpour, now masking the sound of their heavy footsteps. Bea's lungs burned, her legs aching with every pounding step on the pavement, but the grip Lucas had on her arm was an iron tether, keeping her moving. They wove through 3 blocks of derelict buildings before Lucas suddenly veered toward an underground parking structure attached to an abandoned commercial complex. He led her down a dark ramp, stopping before a chain-link gate secured with a heavy padlock. Lucas didn't hesitate. He pulled a small, sleek pistol he had retrieved from a hidden stash near the egress window and shot the lock. The suppressed cough of the weapon barely echoed. Inside the private lockup sat a massive matte black armored Chevrolet Suburban. Lucas bypassed the ignition with a biometric key fob hidden beneath the wheel well. The heavy V8 engine roared to life, a beautiful, powerful sound in the cold, damp garage. "Get in," he ordered. Bea practically collapsed into the passenger seat, depositing the disgruntled cat bag onto her lap. Once they broke through the garage doors and hit the rain-slicked streets, Lucas didn't speed. He drove with calculated precision, blending into the sparse late-night traffic. He opened a hidden reinforced compartment in the center console and pulled out a ruggedized encrypted tablet. He handed the steering wheel over to his knee for a moment as his fingers flew across the screen. Bea watched, catching her breath, her clothes plastered to her skin. "What are you doing? Shouldn't we just get on the highway?" Victor thinks he controls the muscle, but he fundamentally misunderstands the infrastructure of our operations, Lucas said, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the screen. "We don't just extort money, we move heavy product. I designed a proprietary warehouse management system to handle our entire supply chain. It tracks every truck, every cargo ship, and every corrupt port official on our payroll across the eastern seaboard." He pulled up a digital map, overlaid with moving green and red nodes. He expects us to run like frightened animals in a lone car. But I'm accessing our freight transport organization plan. We have a massive convoy of commercial trucks heading out of the city tonight. I am overriding the container release procedures remotely. Bea watched in bewildered fascination. This ruthless mobster, bleeding onto the leather seats, was operating like a high-level logistics executive. "I'm rerouting 4 heavily loaded 18-wheelers to run a parallel block on Interstate 90. Lucas explained, his voice tight with concentration. "They will form a rolling blockade across all 3 lanes. Victor's pursuit vehicles won't be able to bypass them, and the highway patrol will just register it as heavy, slow-moving transport operations. We will slip through the transport corridor completely undetected, shadowed by our own freight." "You use commercial logistics to hide your movements?" Bea whispered, genuinely impressed. "The best place to hide a monster is in plain sight," Lucas replied softly. He set the tablet down and finally looked at her. In the dim glow of the dashboard, Bea looked a mess. Her frizzy hair was plastered to her round cheeks, her clothes were soaked and mud-stained, and she was clutching a bag containing a very angry cat. Yet Lucas had never seen anything quite so magnificent. She had not panicked. She had not dissolved into useless tears. When the world burned around them, she had simply picked up a lighter and fought back. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice losing its harsh edge. He reached over, turning the massive SUV's heating system on high. "I'm fine," Bea said, shivering slightly. She looked down at her damp, clinging clothes, suddenly painfully aware of how much space she took up in the passenger seat. "I ruined your very expensive leather seats with alley mud." Lucas let out a low rumble of a laugh. "Beatrice, you saved my life tonight. You can burn this entire car to the ground if you want to." He reached across the center console, his large, calloused hand resting gently over hers. The warmth of his touch sent an unexpected shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. They rode in silence for the next 3 hours, securely tucked behind the massive wall of Lucas's rerouted freight trucks, safely insulated from the violence of the city they left behind. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon when the Suburban turned off the main highway and began a steep, winding ascent into the Berkshire Mountains. The landscape shifted from concrete sprawl to dense, towering pines and thick, rolling fog. After miles of navigating unmarked dirt roads, they approached a massive 10-foot-high steel gate flanked by stone pillars. Lucas rolled down the window and pressed his thumb against a hidden biometric scanner. The heavy gates swung open silently. Bea stared in awe. The safe house was not a rustic cabin. It was an impenetrable fortress, disguised as a modern architectural marvel of glass, dark wood, and steel nestled perfectly into the side of a mountain. As they pulled into the sprawling courtyard, the front doors of the estate flew open. A team of men in tactical gear rushed out, led by a tall, heavily scarred man with sharp blue eyes. "Boss!" the man shouted, rushing to the driver's side as Lucas cut the engine. This was Sullivan Lucas's head of personal security. We got the encrypted ping from the transport corridor. Medical is waiting inside. Lucas stepped out, his face pale and drawn, the adrenaline finally wearing off. He leaned heavily on the open door. Get Dr. Caldwell down here, immediately. And Sullivan. Lucas pointed to the passenger side, where Bea was climbing out, carefully holding Barnaby's bag. This is Beatrice. She is under my absolute, unconditional protection. Anyone looks at her wrong. They lose their eyes. Understand? Sullivan didn't blink. He gave Bea a sharp, respectful nod. Understood, boss. Ma'am, let us help you inside. The next few hours were a whirlwind of efficiency. Lucas was whisked away to a state-of-the-art medical wing, located in the east wing of the house. Bea was gently but firmly escorted by an older, stern-faced housekeeper named Martha to a massive guest suite on the second floor. Draw a hot bath, Miss Beatrice. Martha said, her tone professional but kind. I will have some dry clothing brought up for you immediately. When Bea emerged from the scalding, luxurious marble tub an hour later, her muscles feeling like melted butter, she found a stack of clothes neatly folded on the velvet ottoman. She had expected the usual humiliation clothes that were laughably small, a stark reminder that she didn't fit into this opulent world. But to her shock, the garments were beautiful. A pair of wide-leg black silk lounge pants and a beautifully draped, oversized cashmere sweater. They slid over her generous curves, perfectly soft and forgiving, making her feel oddly regal. Barnaby was already curled up on a massive California king bed, purring loudly after being fed fresh salmon by the kitchen staff. A soft knock came at the door. It was Sullivan. Mr. Russo is asking for you, ma'am, if you're feeling up to it. Bea took a deep breath, smoothing down the soft cashmere over her hips, and followed the guard down the long, quiet hallways. Lucas was in the master suite, propped up against a mountain of pillows in a bed large enough to sleep 6. His chest was freshly bandaged, an IV line dripping fluids into his arm, but the color had returned to his face. His dark eyes locked onto her the second she walked into the room. He dismissed Sullivan with a flick of his wrist, and the heavy door clicked shut, leaving them alone. You look beautiful, Lucas said, his voice a low, raspy purr that made Bea's breath catch in her throat. She blushed a deep red, flushing her cheeks. I look like I'm wearing a very expensive tent. She deflected a nervous habit she used whenever someone complimented her. Lucas's expression darkened slightly. Come here, Beatrice. She walked over to the edge of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lucas reached out his warm hand, wrapping around her thick wrist, and gently pulled her down to sit on the edge of the mattress. Do not insult the woman who saved my life, he said seriously, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the fullness of her face, the wide, soft expanse of her hips, the heavy, beautiful weight of her presence. In Lucas's world, women were sharp angles, hollow cheeks and fragile bones. They were easily broken. Beatrice was solid. She was an anchor in a storm. Most men prefer... Bea started looking down at her lap, suddenly incredibly self-conscious. I am not most men, Lucas interrupted fiercely. I deal with fragile, hollow people all day. You stood in a dark alley against 12 armed killers, and you held your ground. You have fire in you, Beatrice, and you have softness. He moved his hand from her wrist to rest on the curve of her hip, his touch reverent. Do not ever apologize for the space you take up. Not in my house. Not ever. Bea looked up, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. For the first time in her life, a man wasn't looking past her weight. He was looking directly at it, and he was captivated. She leaned into his touch, the dangerous Mafia Boss, and the exhausted hotel clerk, finding an impossible solace in each other. But the fragile peace was shattered instantly. The heavy bedroom door flew open without a knock. Sullivan stood in the doorway, his face pale, holding a glowing tablet. "Boss!" Sullivan said, his voice tight with dread. "The WMS system, the logistics network." Lucas sat up, wincing. "What about it?" Victor found a back door in the transport tracking software. Sullivan breathed heavily. He didn't just bypass the truck blockade. He used the digital footprint of the freight routing to track the encrypted signal from your car. "They know where we are, boss, and they are coming up the mountain." The shrill, piercing wail of the perimeter alarm shattered the quiet intimacy of the bedroom. Red emergency strobes began to pulse through the frosted glass of the reinforced windows, casting frantic, bloody shadows across the opulent suite. Lucas's reaction was instantaneous. He ripped the IV line from his arm, ignoring the spray of saline and blood, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He reached into the nightstand and pulled out a heavy Glock 19. But as his feet hit the floor, his injured leg buckled. The stitches in his thigh pulled dangerously tight, and he hit his knees with a sharp, involuntary grunt of pain. "Lucas!" Bea cried out, rushing forward. Her large, soft hands gripped his broad shoulders, trying to haul him back up. "You can't fight on a torn femoral artery. You'll bleed to death before you even reach the stairs." "I am not letting Victor take this house." Lucas snarled, his face pale and glistening with a cold sweat. Sullivan burst into the room, his tactical rifle raised, followed by 2 other heavily armored guards. "Boss, we have a massive problem. They bypassed the outer mountain gate. It's not just Brendan's street crew anymore. Victor hired private military contractors, ex-Garda World and Academy veterans. 2 heavily armored tactical trucks are coming up the main drive. They have breaching charges." "How many?" Lucas demanded, leaning heavily against Bea's sturdy frame. "At least 30 men. And Victor is leading them," Sullivan said grimly. "They hacked the estate's automated defense grid, using the very same warehouse management system, backdoor they tracked us with. They locked us out of our own security shutters." Bea looked over Sullivan's shoulder at the glowing tablet in his hands. The screen displayed a complex array of moving red dots over a blueprint of the estate, overlaid with a familiar green text interface. A jolt of pure adrenaline, sharp and clear, cut through her terror. She knew that interface. Before her father's death had forced her to drop out and take the dead-end hotel job, she had been a university honors student in her final year. Her entire life had been logistics. "Wait," Bea said, her voice cutting through the panic of the room. She snatched the tablet from the highly trained head of security. Sullivan blinked, too stunned by the audacity of the fat woman in the cashmere sweater to stop her. "Beatrice, what are you doing?" Lucas asked, his breath ragged. "This is a modified Blue Yonder logistics suite." Bea muttered, her amber eyes scanning the scrolling code with a terrifying, hyper-focused intensity. "Victor didn't launch a cyber attack. He used a supply chain exploit. He treated your estate's security grid like a shipping manifest. He categorized his assault vehicles as priority freight to bypass the gates." "Can you stop them?" Sullivan asked suddenly, realizing that this woman was not just a civilian bystander. "I can do better than stop them," Bea said, a fierce, brilliant smile touching the corners of her lips. She tapped furiously on the glass screen. "My graduation thesis was literally on building a freight transport organization plan by car. I know how to manipulate vehicular flow through choke points. If Victor is using the WMS to command the gates, he left his own terminal open to reciprocal commands." She looked up at Lucas, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire that took his breath away. "I'm going to treat his tactical trucks like misrouted cargo. Outside, the roar of heavy diesel engines echoed off the mountain walls. Victor's armored trucks smashed through the decorative inner courtyard gates, screeching to a halt on the expansive cobblestone driveway. Heavily armed mercenaries poured out, stacking up against the main reinforced glass doors of the mansion. Inside, B was a maestro, conducting a symphony of code. "I'm overriding the container release procedures for the estate's loading bays and underground garage," she announced, her fingers flying. "Sullivan, pull all your men back to the second floor. Give them the ground floor." "Are you insane?" Sullivan barked. "If we give up the ground floor, they'll slaughter us." "Trust her," Lucas ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He looked at B, his chest swelling with a dangerous, intoxicating pride. "Do it, Beatrice." B hit the execute command. Outside, the massive reinforced steel shutters of the estate's primary delivery bay, normally used for receiving secure cargo, suddenly rolled up. Victor, standing in the rain with a suppressed submachine gun, smiled cruelly. He thought his hackers had finally broken the main house locks. Move in." Victor screamed, waving his men toward the yawning black maw of the delivery bay. The 30 mercenaries flooded into the massive concrete-walled holding area. But the moment the last man crossed the threshold, B hit a second command. The heavy steel shutters slammed down with a deafening crash, locking into the concrete with electromagnetic deadbolts. "What happened?" Victor yelled, spinning around in the dark garage. "Now," B whispered in the bedroom, "we initiate the damaged cargo protocol." She activated the estate's industrial fire suppression system. Deep in the garage, massive vents opened in the ceiling, dumping thousands of gallons of thick, suffocating halon foam and freezing water onto the trapped mercenaries. Panic erupted. The contractors, hardened veterans of foreign wars, slipped and thrashed in the rapidly rising, blinding chemical foam. Their tactical gear weighed them down, and the freezing water shorted out their comms and optics. They weren't fighting a gun battle. They were drowning in a reinforced steel box. B watched the thermal cameras on the tablet as the red dots scrambled frantically, then slowly stopped moving as the mercenaries surrendered to the overwhelming environmental trap, dropping their weapons and pounding on the walls for air. "They're neutralized," B said, her voice trembling slightly, as the reality of what she had just done washed over her. She handed the tablet back to Sullivan. "You can vent the room and arrest them now." The 3 heavily armed security guards stared at the large, beautiful woman in the oversized sweater as if she were a goddess of war who had just descended from Olympus. Lucas began to laugh, a deep, rich sound that rumbled from his chest, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He looked at Sullivan. "Go clean up the garbage in my garage, and bring Victor to me." An hour later, the estate was secure. The private military contractors, thoroughly humiliated and shivering from the freezing foam, had been stripped of their weapons and zip-tied by Sullivan's men. Victor Rossi was dragged into the grand library on the first floor. He was soaking wet, his expensive suit ruined his face, bruised from where Sullivan had firmly escorted him up the stairs. He was forced to his knees on the Persian rug. Lucas sat in a high-backed leather armchair by the roaring fireplace, his leg bandaged, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. He looked like a king passing judgment. But what made Victor's blood run truly cold was the woman standing beside Lucas's chair. Beatrice stood tall, her arms crossed over her generous chest, her expression unreadable. She commanded the space, utterly unmoved by the violent men in the room. "Lucas, listen to me," Victor pleaded, his voice cracking. "The Moretti cartel forced my hand. They were going to kill my family. I had no choice." Lucas took a slow sip of his bourbon. "You always had a choice, Victor. You chose ambition over loyalty. You sent 12 men to butcher me in an alley like a dog." Lucas's dark eyes flicked up to Beatrice, softening for a fraction of a second before turning back to Victor with icy resolve. And worse, you put a target on the back of an innocent woman. You underestimated me, and you wildly underestimated her. Please, Victor begged, tears mingling with the dampness on his face. I am not going to kill you, Victor, Lucas said softly. Victor let out a ragged breath of relief. Because death is too quick. Lucas finished his voice, dropping to a lethal whisper. Sullivan has arranged a transport via Maersk shipping. You are going to be locked in a shipping container completely off the grid and sent to a black site prison run by our associates in Eastern Europe. You will spend the rest of your natural life in a concrete box reflecting on the concept of loyalty. Victor screamed as Sullivan and another guard hauled him up by his armpits and dragged him thrashing from the library. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the room into a heavy crackling silence, broken only by the burning logs. Lucas set his glass down. He looked up at Bee, who was staring at the closed doors, processing the brutal reality of the man she had saved. "Does it frighten you?" Lucas asked quietly. "What I am?" Bee turned to look at him. She walked slowly to his chair and knelt on the thick rug beside him. Her knees protested, but she ignored them. She rested her soft, plump hands on his muscular arm. "I grew up in the West End, Lucas. I know what the world is. It is cruel and it is violent," Bee said, her amber eyes searching his. "But last night, when those men had you cornered, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man fighting for his life, and today I saw a man protect me." Lucas reached out his large hands, cupping her round face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, marveling at the warmth of her skin. "You are the most extraordinary creature I have ever met, Beatrice Monroe. You saved my life with a lighter, and you saved my empire with a tablet. You are brilliant. You are fearless." He leaned forward, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made Bee's core melt. "And you are magnificent." "I'm fat, Lucas," she whispered, the old insecurities rearing their ugly heads, a defense mechanism built over 32 years of societal cruelty. "I'm not a mafia wife. I'm not a trophy. You are a queen," Lucas corrected fiercely, his hands sliding down to grip the soft, generous curve of her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "I do not want a fragile trophy. I want a partner who can stand in the fire with me. I want the woman who takes up space in my world and refuses to apologize for it. Every inch of you is power. Every curve is mine to worship if you'll let me." Bee's breath hitched. The raw sincerity in his voice broke down the last of her walls. She lifted her hands, tangling her fingers in his dark, thick hair. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was a collision. It was heat and desperation, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that they had found exactly what they had been missing. Lucas groaned, pulling her heavy, gorgeous body up onto his lap, ignoring the protest of his wounded thigh. He wanted to feel the absolute weight of her against him. Bee straddled his lap, sinking into him, her hands roaming over his broad shoulders, matching his hunger with a fierce passion of her own. For the first time in her life, her body wasn't a burden. It was an instrument of profound pleasure and power. 6 months later, the underworld of the eastern seaboard had shifted. Lucas Russo was undisputed, his empire running smoother and more profitably than ever. But the streets whispered not just of the Don, but of the woman at his side. They whispered of Beatrice Russo, the brilliant, unapologetically heavy queen of the syndicate, the woman who completely overhauled the organization's logistics network, hiding billions in illicit trade through impenetrable, flawless freight routing. She wore custom-tailored silk gowns that accentuated her vast, beautiful curves, and when she walked into a room, made men bowed their heads in genuine respect. Lucas never looked at another woman. Why would he? He had found the woman who ignited the fire, the woman who held the keys to the empire, and the woman who finally made his dark, violent world feel like home. And that is the epic conclusion of Beatrice and Lucas's story, from a terrifying alleyway ambush to becoming the brilliant, unapologetic queen of the Russo Empire. They proved that true power and beauty come in all sizes. If you loved seeing this fierce, plus-size heroine use her logistics genius to save the day, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic, twist-filled romance stories. See you next time.